Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this distinctive Demilune table. So join us! This Demilune table is an exciting project for several reasons. The four-way taper of the cherry wood legs and the bridal joinery are two great techniques. In addition, to make the curved apron, we'll be using a bentwood lamination process. And we're going to introduce you to the vacuum press to make a beautiful Madrone Burl Veneer for the tabletop. The half-moon shape and elegant lines of this table captures the romance of the past. The slender tapered legs rise gracefully to a richly colored cherry wood apron. But it's the tabletop that captures the eye. The magnificent Madrone Burl Veneer, with its rich texture and color, commands attention in any room. You've seen the rare beauty of the grain and texture in the table. Now I'd like to show you its roots, so to speak. This 5-foot slice of Madrone Burl was once part of a great tree that graced a forest along the Oregon coast. It probably lived to be over 100 years old. And I thought you'd find it interesting, as I do, to see a piece of wood like this in the rough. For a lot of us, we only get to see the finished lumber, only what the lumber yards have to offer. So it's rare we can take an actual rough slab like this and craft a piece around its beauty. I've taken a plane and shaved a bit to reveal the grain. As you can see, there's a fantastic burl pattern here. And from that, I've drawn out a strategy to cut this massive slab into some usable planks that will mill into slices that will become the veneer for our tabletop. So with a saw and a great deal of respect, we'll begin today's project by trimming away the rough edges. Here's our rough plank. There's a very interesting marking here that I'd like you to take a look at. This is called spalting. It's actually a fungus that gets into the wood after the tree has died. This is going to make for a very distinctive pattern in our finished tabletop. Now first we'll start by joining the face of the board to get it flat. Slowly pushing the board through the jointer on an angle will help minimize chip out. Using our jointed face as a reference, we run the plank through the planer to cut a parallel surface on the opposite side. At the bandsaw, we cut 2 thin slices of the Madrone plank. Each slice, or veneer, will be 3/32 of an inch thick. It's a good idea to use a fingerboard to help secure the stock. When we put the slices together, it's easy to see what the beautiful book-match veneers will look like when they are glued up. After applying glue to the edges, use clamps to pull them together, and then add bricks to keep them flat. With the burl veneer for our tabletop complete, we'll cut the cherry stock to make our curved apron. We'll take 3.5-inch wide boards of cherry and cut them into 7 thin strips. Now we'll take these strips of wood and bend them into this form. This form is made by stacking 5 sheets of MDF together so that they equal the width of the apron, which is 3.5 inches. We cut a semi-ellipse into the form, making 2 passes on the bandsaw and taking into consideration the thickness of the apron, which is 3/4 of an inch. We added a layer of cork to the outside face of our form to serve as a cushion in case there are any imperfections in the form. The cork will fill in the gaps and ensure we get a nice uniform glue line. Using a slow-setting plastic resin glue, we glue all the inside faces and stack up the strips to form a laminate sandwich. Then, we place the sandwich into the form, clamp it together, and let it set to dry for 24 hours. Here's our finished apron. This came out looking really nice. Now because we sawed our laminate so thin, we've got minimal spring back. Now we're actually going to run this over the jointer to get it flat and then through the planer to make it parallel. But before we do, we're going to take the belt sander and remove this excess glue because that'll be abrasive to the knives. Make sure you hold the belt sander parallel to the surface and make even strokes so you don't damage the edges. Then we pass the apron over the jointer, following the arc of the curve to produce the flat edge we want. Next, we run the apron through the planer to produce a flat and parallel surface on the opposite edge. With our laminated apron milled, we're going to trim it to length. So we put it back onto the form to make the layout marks for the cuts. Now we did this for two reasons. First, to get the reference line, which already exists on the form, and second, so that we can hold it at the proper curvature so that our marks are accurate. Since this piece is curved, this edge, where it meets the back apron, might not be exactly at 90 degrees. We know that ours is off by 2 degrees. So when you make your cuts, you'll have to make the adjustments accordingly. Using the bandsaw, we cut off the edges of our apron at 90 degrees. To make the back of the apron, we'll cut some 3.5-inch wide cherry stock at the table saw with the blade set at 2 degrees. This will create a tight fit where it meets the curved part of the apron. We'll join the apron together using biscuit joinery. We'll use 2 number 20 biscuits on each side. We'll glue it and clamp it securely. The apron for our table is now complete. Now we'll make the legs. We've milled the stock for our legs. Let's take a look at our example. Our legs have a distinctive 4-way taper. And to join them to our apron, we'll cut a bridal joint at the top. A bridal joint is a classic style of joinery. To make it, we'll cut away the stock in the center and match it to the thickness of our apron. We lay out our measurements on our leg stock and then cut the bridal joints at the bandsaw. After we make our first cut, we add a spacer that's the same thickness as the apron. And then we make our other cut. Next, we use a 5/8-inch Forstner bit at the drill press and drill away the bulk of the stock. Finally, we'll clean it up and make it square with a chisel. Now let's take a look at the spacing of the legs and how they fit before we cut our tapers. Our legs are going to be spaced evenly along the apron. Now here's something that's important. Because our apron is curved, we'll need to use the block plane and create a flat spot so that we can get a snug fit for our bridal joinery. The back legs that attach to the intersection of the apron will need to be trimmed to accommodate the joinery. But that's simple to do. All we have to do is to notch away some of our bridal joint. This is the jig we'll use to cut our tapers. We've designed our legs to have a slight taper on all 4 sides, graduating from 1 3/4 inch square at the top down to 7/8 of an inch square at the foot. Because you'll be making a cut on all 4 sides, it's a good idea to get into the habit of rotating your stock only in one direction. And after you make each cut, number that side to identify it, and that way you won't make any mistakes. The jig holds the legs secure so you can batch cut the 4 legs. Remember, always rotate the legs in the same direction and number the sides. After you make the second cut on each leg, stop. Add a spacer to the jig before you make the last 2 tapers. Since we cut away our flat references on sides 1 and 2, the spacer properly positions the leg for the 3rd and 4th tapers. To soften the edges of our legs, we've rounded them over by hand using some 220 grit sandpaper. Now we're ready to glue our legs to our apron. First, we glue the back legs with yellow glue and clamp them securely into place. Then we glue the front legs. Since we're using bridal joinery and there's a long grain to long grain surface, the joints will be strong enough without adding screws. Remember, when aligning the legs with the apron, it's critical to make sure they're square. Also, use some cork blocks underneath the clamps, and that way you won't mar the wood. Now, it's time to make the top. Let's take a look at our example. Our top is made from 3/4-inch apple plywood, which is our substrate, banded in cherry, with our Madrone Burl Veneer on the top and cherry veneer on the bottom. To make our top, we'll make a template similar to the form we used to make our curved apron. Now let me show you a simple and a really cool way to generate an elliptical form. First, we need two important dimensions, a long axis and a short axis. Now keep in mind that we want the long axis, which is the length of our tabletop, to extend 1.25 inches past our aprons on both sides. And we want the short axis, which is the width of our tabletop, to extend 1.25 inches past the apron as well. Now these are design considerations based upon selecting careful proportions and the amount of wood we have. Here's some MDF for our template. First, we transferred our long axis measurement onto our template. Then, from our center point, we marked our short axis. Now here's some simple math. Subtract the short axis from the long axis, and that will give you a working number. Next, take that working number and divide it in half. Measure out from the center point along the long axis to establish a left and a right point. Now, take a piece of string, wrap it around the pins, and stretch it out to mark the short axis. That will form a triangle. Next, tie a knot in your string. Using a pencil, put a little tension on the string and draw your ellipse. Now, we'll use a jigsaw to rough cut our template. And then, we'll clean up the edges with a pattern maker's rasp. Now we'll attach our template to our plywood substrate with some wood screws. Now earlier, we glued on a strip of cherry to cover up the plywood edge, and then we flush trimmed it with a router. We did this while the board was square because it's much easier to get the clamps on. So now we'll line up our template and attach it. Using the bandsaw, we rough cut our plywood substrate. We'll save the fall off from the cut and use it as a form when we band the front edge of the tabletop with cherry veneer. Next, we clean up the edges with a flush bearing bit at the router table. The bearing follows along the template while the carbide cutter smooths the edge. Now we'll apply glue and band all the edges of our plywood substrate with a thin strip of cherry. To get good clamping pressure, we'll use the plywood fall-off we cut earlier as a form. Here's some good advice. Raise the substrate with some shims. That will ensure that the strips of cherry will cover the edges of the plywood. After the glue is dry, we use a handsaw to cut the cherry banding to proper size. And we use a scraper to trim the banding flush with our tabletop. We've just finished cutting the cherry veneer for the underside of our table. Now before we put this whole assembly into the vacuum press, we need to finish cutting the Madrone Burl Veneer at the bandsaw. We cut our Madrone Burl Veneer a bit oversized, about 1/4 of an inch more than the size of our plywood substrate. We're gluing up our wood sandwich, so to speak, our plywood substrate with our cherry veneer on the bottom and our Madrone Burl Veneer on the top. We need to apply glue to both sides of the substrate, and we also need to apply glue to the veneers. Be sure to apply generous layers of yellow glue and spread it with a roller until it lays out uniformly, making sure to get good coverage along the edges. Then we put the sandwich together, making sure we align the edges carefully. This is our vacuum press. We'll place our glued up tabletop inside and then seal it. Now I've applied some blue tape to the veneers, and that'll just help to make sure that our veneers don't shift around on us. Next, we'll place this caul on top, and this will help distribute the pressure. Now, when we turn the pump on, it'll suck the air out and create over 1,500 pounds of pressure per square foot on our wood and glue sandwich. It'll take about 2 hours of this pressure to bond our veneers to our substrate. Now, we'll complete our tabletop and mount it to the base. Our tabletop came out looking great. We removed the excess veneer from the edges using the flush bearing bit at the router table. The veneer process makes our top look like one solid piece of wood. Now all we have to do is scrape it, sand it, and we can mount it to the base. To attach our top to the base, we'll use figure-8 fasteners. We use a Forstner bit and a hand drill to make the recesses in the apron where the figure-8s will be fastened with screws. Then, we flip the table over and attach the base to our tabletop by placing screws in the exposed fasteners. Now we're ready to apply our finish. Our finish is a mixture. 8 ounces of water mixed with 1/2 teaspoon of potassium dichromate. Remember, this solution is toxic, so wear gloves and use care when applying. This Demilune table is a picture of romantic style. The potassium dichromate finish brings out the natural reddish-brown hues of the cherry. A perfect frame for a Madrone Burl top with its unique swirling grain patterns that gives this piece a warm, nostalgic glow. The design of this table lends itself to a variety of different woods that you could use for the veneer. Depending upon which color tones you prefer, you could use anything from a bird's eye maple for a lighter tone, to a crotch grain mahogany for a medium tone, or to something like Macassar ebony for a dark, rich texture. These are just a few examples. There's a whole spectrum of colors and textures out there. So experiment. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Marks. We'll see you next time on WoodWorks.